Hello and welcome to our webinar today on webinar BrandQ webinar series, Ink on Paper, the importance of substrate and ink for brand color. I'm Steve Ballinger. I'll be the behind-the-scenes host, and I'll be turning it over to a moment to Ron Ellis, who will be really hosting the full webinar along with Jim Roth, and he'll introduce themselves in just a moment. Just a couple little things. One is everybody is on mute, so if you have a question, you can just type it right into the chat box there on the right-hand side and send it up, and we'll take all the questions at the end. And so you can ask a question anytime. So if something comes to mind, feel free to ask it. Also in the chat box or type it in. Also, a recording of the webinar will be sent to all the registrants. I'm going to try to get that out late today, but if it doesn't come out late today, look for it maybe Monday. But everybody will get a recording of the webinar as well. So that will be coming here soon. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ron Ellis, who will kind of get us started. Ron, I'm going to hand you the controls, and he'll get us started with today's webinar.
Thanks, Steve. And let me just get set up here, and we'll get going. So today's topic, we're going to talk about ink and paper, or ink on paper. And this is a topic that I end up spending quite a bit of time with brands on, and has a lot to do with the color they're going to get, and especially when the brand is trying to really get semi-precise or somewhat precise with the color. This topic becomes really, really, really important. So we're going to go through that, and both Jim and I will give presentations on it, and then we'll have questions at the end. So we'll start off. My name is Ron Ellis. I'm a consultant, and I spend probably a third of my time directly working with brands. About a third of my time I'm in printing plants calibrating and doing color management type stuff. And then the other third I do some stuff for different companies and training, and I do quite a bit for Idealliance as a G7 trainer. And also print properties, which is an Idealliance committee that works on print standards. But anyway, that's who I am. Jim Roth is our presenter also, and he's from Flint Group. And I run into Jim quite a bit in printing plants over the years. I've bounced into him in many of these high-end packaging plants where he's in there doing color and working with color. And he has quite a background. So his, whoops, sorry, flip back here. Whoops, that's the wrong. Excuse me one sec. Hang on. I've got WebEx taking over. Hang on one sec. Let me just see if I can get PowerPoint back up and running. There we are. Sorry about that. So he's got quite a background. He's for years done calibration. He became a G7 expert in 2008, and he leads the G7 expert team at Flint. And very knowledgeable. He's involved in print properties. He was just on the call that we just had. Has great depth of knowledge, knows a lot about color, knows a lot about printing, and a lot about what brands are trying to do and how to achieve it. So we're both going to present, and we're going to talk about examples of deviation and what happens with paper and substrate. And Jim has some really good examples that he's going to show, some visuals that are quite good at showing the difference in what happens when you change substrate. We'll talk about what colors get affected, and we'll talk about the gamut, what happens when the gamut of the device is changed by the substrate. And I'm going to give some examples of brands and what they do with their substrates, how they actually control this. Because it's, if you don't control the substrate, you're going to see as we go through this that without controlling the substrate, it becomes much harder to control the color. There was a paper company that was also going to be on here today, but he ended up, the gentleman ended up having to be on an airplane. But when we first had this topic, he was like, oh no, I'm just going to end up getting bashed about paper, because paper's inconsistent, paper's this, paper's that. And when I talked to him a little bit about how brands actually spec and control the substrate to control color, he was a little bit more interested in that part of it. Then we're going to talk about controlling substrates across regions and how we do that. Before we get into our presentation, which we'll start in just a minute, the first thing I'll do is talk a little bit about the BrandQ program. So BrandQ is an Idealliance program, and it's based, or the main idea of it is to help brands and the supply chain understand and talk about the same thing. There's three main ideas with the program. First big idea is communicate, and that's to basically enable communication between the brand and the supplier. And very often what we find is they don't speak the same language. So, you know, while they're both talking to each other, they may not be talking about the same thing or in ways that they can each understand. So one of the first things we do with BrandQ is try to help people learn and be able to communicate their expectations. We have education. That's where we actually teach the brands and the printers the nuts and bolts of measurement and quality control and how to specify and control and evaluate color. And while you might think that every printing plant out there already knows how to do this, it depends on the type of customer, and very often they might need to have some of the same education as the brand. Brands very often, unless they're a big brand and they've built a quality program, can use quite a bit of help in understanding how to specify and control the color. The third part of BrandQ is validating, and that's where we actually measure and validate. So for some of the brands, Idealliance actually has a lab that does some validation. And of course, G7 experts and BrandQ experts who understand this work with brands and teach them how to measure and understand what these measurements mean. So those are some of the basics of BrandQ. A few pictures here. If you look at this picture on the left, you can see these are all print buyers and creatives who are learning how to measure, learning how to talk and specify color, and working on that. We have classes. We have custom classes that happen right at a brand, and we also have some public classes that occur as well. For communication, these are people looking at a print sample, and they're talking about what's going on with it. And in trying to figure out how do you communicate what you see visually, and how does that correlate to a measurement, and how do you make that all come together. And validate. And validate has to do with measurement and actually seeing that the supply chain did what you asked and met it. And you can see some of the samples here. BrandQ happens live, but there's also an online version of BrandQ, and in the online version, you can order a kit where you can go through and do these measurements and learn how to measure. So I'm going to talk first, and then I'll have Jim talk, because his examples are more exact and specific, and mine are kind of general examples. But the first thing, whenever I'm talking with people about color control and quality, the first thing that I end up talking to them about has to do with substrate. And very often before I go into a printing plant to do a calibration, or if I'm talking to a brand about a supply chain issue, one of the first things that I'm always checking and discussing with them has to do with substrate and what is the substrate. I have some examples up here on the screen. This is the little Idealliance BrandQ form. It's a test form, and usually a brand would put their own images here over on the left. These are placeholders, but they put their own in, have a printer print it, and they would evaluate how well they did both for the visual and by measurement. You can see little spot color ramps and things here too. But if we look at it, we have three different substrates. So if I go through these, you know, this is one substrate. This would be grackle. If I look over here, I have another substrate. This, I think, is a SBS, actually a CCN, so this is a recycled board. And then I have a third one over here that's an SBS, and that's kind of a yellowish folding carton type board. So these are all three different substrates. If you look at the screen, you can see there's quite a bit of difference between these three. And if I put them all together, you can see the difference right there. Now, depending on the type of product that you're printing, this may not matter, or it may matter a lot. So you can see the difference that we see there is only caused by the substrate. So on the one on the left is a brighter commercial sheet. You can see it's quite white. Colors are quite vivid. The one on the right is the SBS, and you can see everything over there moves to the yellow side. The board itself is yellow, and it's moving all the color to be yellower. And then in the middle, we have the recycle board, which is duller and still not quite as bright. Now, for kind of lower value products, maybe some of the quick food stuff that you just open and use, not to denigrate cereal boxes, but for things in that market of cereal boxes or frozen food or these type things, maybe they don't really care that much. They can live with what the substrate does to the artwork here, and they design for it and get the most out of it. But if we're talking about the higher end products, and these might be electronics or pharmaceutical products or cosmetic type stuff, this difference in color shift that you see here would be unacceptable to them. And it becomes really, really important because somewhere there is a designer, and if they're making generic proofs, they probably look like what's on the left. But when they actually hit a packaging plant, if they don't really control this, what's going to happen to the color is what you see on the right. So substrate becomes a really, really big one, big issue here. And that big question, of course, is which is the right one? Which is correct? And that's a whole other one. I threw another one in there. That's Fogra 51. That's a super optically brightened paper. So which of these is right? And which paper is the one that the brand wants? And just looking at all those objects, even though, it's on your monitor, it's not really printed, but it's showing you here, you can see that shift. Everything goes yellow or blue or more neutral, less neutral, depending on the substrate. And Jim will show examples of this that are they're quite good because he's got some good visuals. So I'll wait till he gets to those. But they give a great quick show of how this actually works. But that question, which is right? Which is right is, the answer to that is the right one is the one that the customer actually wants. And tied into that, of course, is how much are they paying for paper and the rest of the process. So which one is right is determined by the customer, but that has to be done with the supply chain to make sure you get the correct result. So if we look at this, you can see some pictures here. This is where I went into one of my customers, and they basically took and they fanned out a whole bunch of different substrates. When I go into a customer, I'll try to figure out what do they use for substrates, what type do they print with, and what do they have there. And you can see here this big range of substrates here, and these will all have quite an effect on the color. So these substrates will all have a big effect on the color. It's it's important to be aware of it. And of course, when I'm calibrating, and probably for Jim as well, when I go in, I have to get the proof to press match. I have to get the press sheet to be correct, and I have to get the proof to be correct, and I have to make those match. And a lot of that has to do with this substrate color that you see here. If the substrate colors are too far apart, then there is no way I'm going to get a match. Now, on this little screen that you see right here, you can see that I have a little chart. And the main idea here is that if the paper is different enough, then you're no longer printing to the same print condition. The example that you can see on the screen here is an example from our substrate relative calculator. So this is showing Grackle over here on the left. And that's showing the color of the paper, and then there's LAB numbers there showing the color of all the inks. And you can see that if I shift that, so I shifted it to an SBS or a folding carton board that's a little on the yellower side, you can see the blue becomes less blue. You can see the yellow becomes more yellow, that number goes up. And all these colors shift in the direction of the board. Jim might talk a little bit more about this. He has some slides about this. But it's called substrate correction. I showed it to you real quickly. Whoops. And let's see, I'll flip it over here. This is our little spreadsheet. It's available from Idealliance, or if you go to grackle.org, you could download it. But it's a little spreadsheet where people can plug in a paper. They can plug in your value. Maybe if I did a recycled board, and then it will predict what's going to happen to it. So that's what we're seeing here. It then corrects the entire data set, so that entire print condition. So that main idea, if the paper is different enough, you are no longer printing to the same print condition. So if I wanted to go to Grackle, if I was in an agency somewhere in this country, maybe in New York or California or Chicago or Minneapolis or somewhere, or Vermont, who knows where, or New Hampshire, like where I am, I could be in there, and this might be what I print on my proof. This might be what I think I'm going to get. If I go into a different paper, I'm going to get this based on the color of the paper. And I can see delta E's over here, and these are showing me how far off I am. If I'm too far off, I'm no longer printing to the same print condition. There's not much of a chance I'm going to get a good color match. So if the paper is different enough, then you're no longer printing to the same print condition. Keep that in mind. It's important. Ink also impacts your color. We're talking a lot about substrate, but the type of ink that gets used, and Jim knows way more about this than I do, but the type of ink that gets used has a big impact. So there are reasons that they might use a special ink, and it might have to do with a substrate or a printing process or a coating or lamination that has to take effect. But some inks may also have a reduced gamut or a different ability to hit the color that you need. So you can see we have all these colors we usually try to hit: cyan, magenta, yellow, black, our overprints, red, green, blue, and our grays. But with certain ink sets, I can't get all of this, or I may not be able to get any of this, depending on the reason I'm using the ink. That's a little bit less common than the substrate issue we're talking about, but keep in mind that ink will impact your color as well, and that you might be doing something very special. Maybe you're printing on plastic or something, and in that case, the supplier has to use an ink that no longer can hit, the targets that you're designing to. So you have to know all this when you're designing and be aware of it, and your supplier should be able to help you with it. Another thing, gamut can affect everything. So if we look at ink, paper, 3 different print conditions here. Outside print condition is grackle. That's pretty standard printing, very similar to Fogra. That's how we print. That's how it looks. That next one that you see inside there, so the one that's just inside here, that is a CCNB. That's a recycled board. Same exact ink, just by changing the paper. You can see that I get this reduction in gamut here. So that's just by changing that board. That recycled board is quite a bit duller, and it's quite a bit more neutral. It's not as bright, and you can see that I lose gamut in there. So be aware of that. The board that you're printing on, or the paper, or the material, can actually significantly not only change the color, but the volume of color or the gamut of that device. Now, an extreme example, if you look at the one in the middle, that is same ink, different paper. That's printing on an uncoated sheet. So same ink, put it on an uncoated sheet, and you can see I've reduced the gamut quite a bit there. So as you're looking at paper and as you're looking at substrate and looking at all of this, be aware that just by changing paper, you can reduce your gamut quite a bit, even with the same ink. I have a little example here I'll show. I live in New Hampshire. This is just around the corner from where I live. And looking over here at Mount Lafayette, but you can see just by changing paper, look at the gamut change here. See the blue of the helmet, everything, you can see how that changes. That's actually that uncoated sheet. But if I went to CCNB, you'd see that same thing in a little bit less dramatic, but the blue would become less blue, everything would get duller. So just by changing substrate, even with the same ink, I can affect the gamut quite a bit. There's some ways that we can assess this and we can figure out what's going to happen. I showed that little spreadsheet, which is the SCCA Calculator. And you can take that calculator, make a profile, load it into Photoshop, load it into your RIPs, and you can see what you just saw here. It can give you that little, heads up, thumbs up of what's going to happen. The examples that I showed before, so these examples here, these were all created using the SCCA Calculator. So we can tell, the math is pretty well defined for standard printing. And if it's on standard substrates, we can do a pretty good prediction without ever going there. And many of the brands use these predictions to do their design so they get the correct result. And Jim will show a little bit of that or talk a little bit about that. You can talk to your suppliers. So your supply chain, they have an idea what will happen when they go into these substrates, and they can help you with this as well. So they can give you some information. Remember, as a brand, you never want to do this on your own. I shouldn't say that. That sounds like you can't do anything. But you want to work with your partners. So you can do the calculations and all this on your own, but talk to your partners about what you're doing, because depending on the coatings and the ink, there may be a gamut reduction, or there might be a way they can make it bigger. Grackle is just sort of standard printing. There are ways to print with even more color and larger gamut. So talk to your supply chain. The tools I showed here, we can use Photoshop, we can use a proofer, and with those and these profiles we make, we can simulate what's going to happen. We also might have print tests where you can record data and see that as well. Another tool and another way to do that is to talk to your ink company. So some of the brands that I work with, they actually contract ink companies. They have a large supply chain, many, many printers. And before they pick a brand color, they'll actually talk to the ink company, and they'll have an ink company or maybe multiple ink companies do drawdowns of the color on a substrate to see how close it can get and to see how accurate it looks and what that substrate will do to it. So ink companies can do drawdowns, they can do test prints, they can put coating down and help you see what happens with a ink when you do a coating or a lamination, so you can actually predict what that color should be. I had another customer earlier this week who had emailed me, and they had a product they're printing. It's a Pantone color, but it's laminated. And the lamination changed the color so much that the customer is not happy with the result and wants to fix it in the future. That's the perfect time when you might go to an ink company or your supplier and have them actually do a drawdown with the coating or the lamination and then determine the correct build to make that color come out correct. It's quite common issue. One other issue, if we look at large brands or not even super large brands, many brands, many suppliers use a lot of substrates. So if I looked at one of my customers, I could look in there, typically into a folder, and I might see that they use 16 or 20 different substrates. There's some brands I work with, very similar. They might use 10, 12, 16, 20 substrates across the world. And I showed that little simulation where we can predict what's going to happen when we change substrate, but nobody wants 20 different print conditions. So the way that this gets handled usually by both either a supplier or a brand would be that we would basically classify the substrate. We group them, and we group them based on the color, meaning are they yellow, are they white, are they blue, and by the surface. So we would put multiple substrates together. So if you're a brand and you print all over the world, and maybe there's 20 different substrates, you would try to drill those down into, here's all the ones that are like an SBS, a yellowish board. Here's all the recycle boards, they're all fall in here. And here's all the, commercial type sheets. And you'd classify these so that you could go out to your supply chain and give them a print condition target for that type of work. And it would be able to be met by a bunch of different papers out there. So that, forget about hitting a million different papers all at once, or if you use 30 papers, try to group those down in. No supplier or printer is going to do 30 calibrations, and nobody wants to manage 30 different print conditions. So you're trying to basically drill these down into, here's a yellowish board, here's neutral, recycled, maybe here's a super bright one that goes on the outside of a wrapper or gets fixed to corrugated. So you're going to try to classify these and do it by white point and, of course, surface, similar method. So that's a kind of a trick that people use to kind of minimize the issues when they're in a large supply chain. And printers do this too. Like I mentioned, they don't want to do 30 calibrations. They want to do, 2, possibly 3. If we look at controlling color and how important it is, that brand, and you can see down here, here's different, papers, a few different white points on them. But if we look at controlling color, controlling that substrate will help you control the color. So if I go back to my little picture here, here I am. I've got my 4 different substrates. You can see they all have an effect. So if I was to go out into the world and I had really tight delta E's and tolerances, and if I told the printer, match my print condition, but they printed on all these substrates, then I'm going to have variation. I probably won't be happy, especially the cosmetics or the high-end electronics type customer. But if I say, whenever you print for me, you're going to use, and I could throw out any paper name, Everest or, Opus or anything like that. When you print for, my brand, you're going to only use this substrate or maybe a couple of substrates. You're going to give them a little range. And if you do that, then it's much better chance that it's going to come out correctly. So when large brands do this, very often, they're going to specify the substrate. That's how they eliminate some of this variation. So if it's a high-value brand, usually that substrate is going to be spec'd as part of their print spec, and they're going to expect you to use that substrate or the comparable substrate with it. Now, that costs more. So if you look at that, that's going to nail down that product. It's going to give you much more consistency, picking a good substrate, but it's going to cost more. The lower value products, and I mentioned cereal boxes and food and, other things like that, not to pick on those, but the ones where they don't require that or the cost doesn't justify it, imagine a $3,000 laptop can really have a nice substrate on it, but like a 99-cent little food packet, there's not a lot of margin in there for them to spend so much on the packaging. So they tend to not specify it. They let the printer pick, and the printer, to make the price competitive, will pick the substrate. So if the brand picks the substrate, remember that there's going to be a higher cost, but you're going to get color control. Sometimes the brand even buys the substrate, but very often suppliers are a little bit better at doing that than the brand can be. So keep that in mind. If you really care about the color, you can specify the substrate, or at least a range of substrate, and get control. If you care a lot, you can pick the exact substrate and get control from that. If we look at regions related to that, many brands print across regions, and when they're printing across regions, they also are trying to control the substrate, but the same substrate is not available in all these different regions. So taking a look at it, basically what they'll do in that case is they're going to use that classification method. So selecting similar, same white point, same surface, but it might be a different paper name. So same idea as classification. So just to summarize, keep in mind when you change the substrate, you're changing the print condition. Change the substrate a lot, you're not printing to the same thing. You can change the gamut. You saw how it could shrink the gamut down. We can predict it with SCCA. That's something I do with a lot of my customers. I spend time helping them understand that. With suppliers and company, they can help as well. If you're a high-value brand, you might want to pick the paper. But it's a big thing. Be aware of all this so you can make really good decisions. So I'm going to flip that over, and Steve, if you can pop that over to Jim, and he can show what he has, and he has some really good concrete examples of this.
All right. Well, great, Ron. Yeah, I'm passing over to Jim there, and go ahead and share your screen, Jim, in the upper left. And just a reminder for everybody, too, you can ask a question in the chat box anytime. So if you have a question, just pop it on in there. All right, Jim, it looks like you're ready to go. Oh, well, you're on mute, though.
Am I on?
Yeah, you're on. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. We were
Okay.
seeing your screen fine before. Yep.
Yeah, hang on.
Here.
All right, sorry about that. I forgot to unmute myself. I thank you for the opportunity to present. It was kind of hard to pick a direction and go that direction and keep it within a year's worth of time. So I'm going to call this a perspective from an ink supplier for the Ink on Paper webinar. It is very important to us to know the substrate. This is an item Flint Group did years ago, originally with a cyan blue, now with a special red. And it's a color quiz, as we call it. We hand it out quite often, and it's basically asking which stocks are printed with the same ink. We can review that again at the end. To give you an example, there's several different substrates there with this red ink on it. When I first started 37 plus years ago, we actually had off-press proofing, on-press proofing, actual proofs from a two-color press or something to simulate four-color process, actually on the work stock. Hang on, I got to move something out of my way. Hopefully this isn't showing up for other people. Later on, we began to get into laminated proofs, items like the Fuji Final Proof, Kodak Approval, actual transparencies laminated to the substrate, quite often the substrate that was printed, which is great for process because now you got your 4-color process simulated on the actual job stock, so when you go to press, you're much closer. Problem is the issue is it took time and was not the most economical way to do proofs, but it was better than a press run. All right, why is my page now not working? Today we have digital and soft proofs or screen-presented proofs. Problem is often the press and the proof use different substrates. These proofs nowadays, yes, they're lower cost, quicker to provide, definite benefit, profile or ICC driven, however you want to term it, able to calibrate to a print condition. So you can actually throw in different profiles for different conditions and can reproduce a substrate. Next issue or concern is many printers I deal with only have one proofing substrate for their digital proofer. So they need to simulate the substrate that they're going to be using it on, so long as they're not trying to go a whiter, bluer substrate than they already have. So if they're going from a nice grackle white proof substrate, they can dim it down to an SBS or a CCNB real easy, but can't go the other way. A lot of these devices have in-process device calibration or validation, so as they're outputting the proof, it actually scans itself and validates it to the profile, which is awesome. However, all this produces new levels of management and complexity. If the printer or proof provider is going to start calibrating their proofs to different substrates, they got multiple profiles to worry about. Yes, it has the ability to simulate the press or print condition, which is good, but there again, there are limitations. And the next, as I go on, is, you got to manage all these different things, and how well are you going to be able to manage that if you've got 30 different print conditions or proof conditions? And it's all good until we get to the printing ink on the press. I have often, and actually do quite often, use the substrate correction or SCCA calibration sheets, but I get into conditions where there is such variation from the substrate that's being laid down on press to the actual substrate that the proof is on, that these correction sheets, when they're starting to get over, you get a white point difference of a delta of 5 or 4 or even 6, you get close, but you will see variation between the proof or press if you try to create a profile that way. So we end up having to go to press to validate everything. Here, one situation, actually two, is working with some printers, printing opaque white ink first down on metallized papers. And what you see on the left is the file color or the grackle profile coming in. And what you see on the right is actually what we get on press when we print that image, severely shifted in compressed color gamut. However, these printers needed to generate a profile, so one, they can produce a proof, and two, supply that profile to the design house and the client so they can actually create the images they're looking for and be able to validate what they want to see when it gets to press. Here, in these, our target profile has the standard grackle white point of 95.0-2, but the press paper with a overcoating for protection and scratch is got a much darker L value, definitely shifted A star to the less red side, and the B star is not bad. We're about the same blueness. So the paper is darker, dirtier, and greener with a high delta E of 8.68 to what we are targeting. So when we go ahead and simulate or go to press, which they've always been doing and trying to match a conventional proof, even the primaries and traps are failing the customer targets or industry targets because of very high delta E, even delta E CMC, delta E 2000. We're seeing very high numbers, which I'll kind of flash up on the screen. So at the end of the day, we need to calibrate the press to what's actually happening and generate a profile for the end users. So press side, prior to going to press, use the substrate correction sheet with standard tolerance with what point we have. And when we got to press, could not always target the lowest delta E, but I did find out over the years that when it comes to it, is to target the hue if we can't hit the delta E's because of variance between the calculations from the spreadsheet to the actual physical event going on press. Here we have a comparison from the Substrate calculator. I just kind of retyped everything to throw it on there, but you can see even on the color images on the left, the file input coming in for CMYK RGB traps, what the Substrate calculator was telling us, and what actually we got on press with these two different printers and on the metallized. The interesting thing is when we got the press, I was able to use the SCCA numbers to validate that we were getting close. Granted, my delta E's on a lot of them were getting better, but also using the delta hue to make sure we're still as good as we can get. But what I learned as we went through this is our blue trap, cyan and magenta, couldn't hit the numbers, and it had a lot to do with the magenta not trapping well over the cyan on one condition because we were not interstation curing with the UV inks. The other condition, the printer was actually using a perm magenta, so it was light fast, so we didn't have the actual color strength needed. So we got similar results. I was able to get everything else in line where I wanted it, but when it came to a special ink or a special wet trapping of ink, we could not hit the numbers, but I could at least validate that we got it as good as we could. When it came to the final result, one printer, their end user was ecstatic. They had a profile that we built from their data, and they actually remeasured sheets and verified the profile that they could use to simulate what's going on press with their inkjet proofing device. The other customer or end user wasn't really happy, and the problem was they're so used to seeing the white point of the proof paper as a brighter white, they didn't like what they saw on the proof, which was a much grayer white, which was actually matching what we were printing for them. So it took a little work, got a lot of pushback from the sales and CSR at the customer, but at the end of the day, guys, this is what you're doing on press. So we kind of split the difference to kind of get some happy parties there, but still simulate closest what we could do on press. So there is a point of sales when you're trying to simulate some rather difficult stocks. As I move on, kind of covering the process condition for four-color process, etc., with a worst-case scenario, is an ink supplier. When it comes to specials or spot colors, by the time the project arrives to us, whether it be an ink room at a printer or an external ink supplier needs to match a color, most of the application or the end use has already been determined. So there are rare cases where major brands will come to our sites or whatever, and we'll work on the different issues and different substrates, but that's usually a rare event. So there are things like finishing, other attributes like light, fast, or chemical-resistant pigments, issues like California Proposition 65 labeling for requirements of packaging to be sold in California. But end of the day, that paper and substrate has already been selected, and we need to achieve the color on that paper to the best of our ability. So any one of those variables can affect what happens in our ability to match the color. Majority of the time, the color match request is supplied, again, to us through the printer or to their in-house ink supplier. It's either supplied as a physical copy or a digital color file. Again, we're supplied the substrate and the end use information, any special coatings or applications so we can choose the right ink. And I can point to that many major brands are actually supplying digital spectrophotometer color data in the CXF or color exchange format, which is great. It makes our jobs easier, clear, concise communication. End users like Coca-Cola, Walmart, Diageo, Hobby, and Nestle's have all had their own color libraries to supply. Other companies working through a third party for verification, Walgreens, Lowe's, may have special colors, but they also work with the Pantone digital library. So by using a library of digital colors, brands can, hang on a second, got to move something, help control their desired color for the products of families of products, folks. Either by using an internal corporation database of color files, color standards, or digital Pantone library. Many of these brands also use a scoring program, some third-party program to actually score printed samples not only for process color, but for the spot colors. One thing I've had issue with these scoring programs is they're great, but they don't score the substrate. So if you're not printing on a substrate that was used to generate the process information, Grackle, or ISO 12647-2, paper 1 white or 2, you're not going to score very well on the colors because your paper white is different. Some of these brands even use these programs to submit the matched color from the printer so they can review and score the printer. So as I noted, many of these don't take into account the substrate. All right, screen down, page down. Recent project that we did at one of our locations was a matched color for a Pantone 9184 pastel tan on a coated one-side label stock with a water-based coating. The initial match request was to use a substrate independent color from the digital library on an 80-pound coated stock. However, when we got further into it with a printer, turns out this end user couldn't use the heavier weight label stock. They had to use a lighter weight label stock of 55-pound coated. So in the middle of the project, after we got colors approved, we had to rematch the color on the new substrate. And the problem is the newer substrate that we had to match was bluer, less yellow, giving it as a total delta E of over 2 in the matched color. And you can see in the bottom where I got the numbers in the paper, and you can see on the left the differences in the substrate, the 80-pound label stock to a 55-pound, another manufacturer label stock, and what happened to the tan visually when we reproofed the same ink on the two different substrates at the same ink film. So it changed the match, so we had to go back and rematch it. So continuing on with that brand of mayonnaise, they had another family of products or container sizes that a couple of months later we had to rematch the tan, but this time on a completely different uncoated label stock, again with a water-based coating. Again, we went back and rematched the color, which is the substrate, now a substrate the dependent match because it was the original approved match that we had on the 55-pound paper. However, the new paper is much bluer and has a higher OBA, where the other paper had next to no optical brighteners to it. So the new match had to contain more yellow pigment, be stronger, and much cleaner to compensate for the bluer uncoated substrate because of the way the ink soaked into the paper, even with a water-based coating. And you can kind of see the difference there between the substrates on the left without seeing the uncoated effect and what we actually got when we proofed the existing tan that was used on the coated paper onto the uncoated substrate, a big shift. So we had to rematch that. So as I'm nearing the end here, minor changes in the substrate color can have a pronounced effect on the end color. The lighter or weaker the color is, whether it's a screen build or a spot or a special color, the more noticeable the change. What I've also seen a general trend in, especially with the newer optically brightened papers, when people are running still M0 measurements without UV included to original Grackle 2006 coated 1V2, is when we're comparing to that defined profile, when we're on the minus blue papers, I often get complaints that the green trap, which is cyan and yellow, tend to fail for delta E numbers, too high in delta E. Same with the yellow and cyan, they tend to drift because of the bluer paper. And it's funny how the green shows the difference first, the green traps. Now, on the opposite side, the more plus B or yellow with a paper like an SBS or a coated label stock, the more I see the difference in the magenta, the red and the blue traps, where the magenta starts shifting to the plus B or yellow side, and the same with the red and the blue traps. All right. So when we come back to circle around to the original color quiz, you can see the variation in this red color with the different substrates, and actually that's one ink printed all at the same film thickness on all those different substrates. And you'll see, kind of like towards the center, you'll see groups of substrate that look pretty close, but there is a measurable difference between the coated and the dull coated, the C1S board stock and the general coated gloss number 1 sheet. Unfortunately, inks are semi-transparent or transparent. Even the most opaque white, as you saw in the beginning, you get a lot of show-through of the substrate. You can't have 100% opaque ink unless you want to put a lot of ink down and spend a lot of money or use lamination substrates. So that about covers it. And I am going to attempt to stop sharing. Thank you.
All right.
No, that was great.
Good, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Steve, can you flip it back to me just for the screen part?
Yeah, 1 second.
And then we'll do our Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's see. And it says I'm sharing my screen, but I only see blackness. Here we go.
Yes.
Okay. So, Steve, we have a few questions.
Yeah, we do. We do have a couple questions. If you have a question right now, just type in the chat box. But we do have a couple questions that have come through. First question was, how do you control color output with dye sublimation substrates such as textiles?
So, with dye sublimation, usually the color control is done with ICC profiling. So we end up spending time doing a linearization and ink cutbacks, using the inkjet device or printer. And then at that point, we're typically controlling it with profiling. But there is a stage of how much ink do we lay down and how much, how much ink do we use. But usually that's done with ICC profiling and, of course, the linearization underneath that.
Okay, and then the second question here is, what if your printer's gamut is larger than Grackle 2013? When you save a file, do you use the ICC profile from the machine /RIP or a standard such as Grackle?
Yeah, I think both of us can answer that. So, Jim, why don't you go first?
Oh, no.
Yeah. Oh, I can. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, why don't you? Because you can cover the color management better.
So typically, Jim and I both have customers who do both expanded gamut when they're doing more color, or we might have customers who occasionally push the inks up, to higher chroma or run at higher densities and make things a little bit more colorful than Grackle. So from the Idealliance world, we had XCMYK, which is where we just push densities up and get more color. Or you could have special inks and things like that. But when I have a customer doing that, which I sometimes do, and especially in the world of inkjet and digital printing, that's even more common. So at that point, I'll characterize, so I'll capture the data, and then I actually run it through an application. So it could be something like ColorAnt by ColorLogic, or it could be, Curve 4, or there's many other programs, but I'll run it through or ESCO has stuff too, but I'll run it through a program that captures it, and then it's going to smooth out the data and synthetically G7 it. And so I'm going to come up with this perfect G7 with that gamut, with that device. So I don't just capture it and make a profile. I usually do this smoothing and correction. But I will capture that, and I will make something out of that. A good example, of course, would be wide format inkjet, but I have another, which would be Gravure, because Gravure very often has higher gamut, especially laminated and things like that. It has a higher gamut than Grackle. So I'll capture that. I'll synthetically G7 it using one of those programs. I'll smooth the data out, and that will become the target print condition for those machines. And that might even be multiple suppliers, not just one location, but they'll then aim at that. They'll aim their inks at it and then match the substrate and everything.
Okay, so that's all the questions that have come in to me. Ron or Jim, somebody could submit a question directly to you too as well if you see anything pop up on your chat there or anything on your screen. If not, that would be all the questions.
Huh. I think, one thing from perspective would be, and Jim, you probably run into this too, but I don't think people in the beginning don't realize the effect of the substrate and how big that can be. So I can think of a major hair color cosmetics company that was doing all their proofs, New York City Grackle proofs. They'd come to the press run. Press run was on a board that was a little more neutral, and they would reject all the printing and, not realizing the effect of the substrate and what they were buying for paper. And so I think people don't realize that.
Yeah, well, like I said, there's several scoring programs out there. I don't want to throw anybody around, but when they say, oh, you've got to run to these numbers, and there are limitations. I mean, you're printing on a box on recycled board or even white SBS trying to hit numbers for blue-white paper. It's not going to happen with your 4-color process. Yeah, we can maybe adjust a spot color or a special, but when you're trying to even hit the cyan or magenta on a different color substrate, and you've got to be a delta of 3.5 away, under, you can't even get there before you even lay a first drop of ink on the paper.
Yep.
So it makes it difficult for the printer to do anything.
Yep. Oops. And then that part of controlling paper, like if you think of, Jim and I we both work with brands that actually spec that paper and how much easier that makes it. So if you go into that plant, it's going to be that paper, then matching color at that point becomes much, much simpler.
Right. Paper or film or whatever.
Yeah, exactly right. So if you as a brand can control that, then the chance of controlling color across all the suppliers becomes much better.
I had a comment come through on that, by the way. It said from Phil, said scoring programs often have a substrate scoring option. It's just that it may be turned off by the brand manager.
Right.
That is correct.
Yeah, and that's because they may not. I think if I think of, I don't know if the one I'm thinking of is the one you're thinking of, Jim, but the where they have that spec, and the spec is basically Grackle Fogra ISO 12647-2 paper, but it's packaging stuff and it's never on that paper, and then you get dinged for those points even though you're not on that substrate. So I think a lot of that may have to do with the brand or the print manager not understanding the specification that well.
Correct. And I've had people tell printers, well, just run an opaque white on the sheet.
Yeah.
I can think of other ways to spend money.
Yeah. No, so paper, I think the big thing is I teach the BrandQ classes. We had one in Belgium a few weeks ago and around the world, but that concept is maybe not everybody understands how important the substrate is if you're going for precision. And it's important. And you can predict it. Once you know what it's going to be, if it's not a normal substrate, you can predict it, proof to it, design to it, and make things quite a bit more accurate.
Okay, well, I think that's it for our questions. We're getting pretty close to our time here. Just a reminder for everybody that a recording will be sent out here. If not late today, look for it on Monday. I certainly want to thank Phil for making a comment here in our comment box. But I want to thank Ron and Jim for presenting today. Really excellent webinar. A lot of great examples. I love the examples with the different substrates and the colors. I guess I'm visual that way. Maybe Ron, I'll leave it to you for any last comments as we wrap up.
Yep. So I think keep BrandQ in mind and check it out if you're interested in it. And keep in mind if you're a brand or somebody doing a lot of precision printing that substrate's really important. Keep in mind your ink company, guys like Jim and your suppliers, that they can answer a lot of these questions. They have a lot of experience. A lot of times they can predict, so they can do drawdowns or test prints and help you understand what's going to happen with it. And Jim, thanks very much for coming. I know you're super busy running around all over the place, and enjoy running into you when I run into you out there as well.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Great.
All right.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you at another BrandQ webinar, maybe in January. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye-bye.